Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today we're going to be talking about the Revolutionary War. When the United States won independence from Great Britain and the world was turned upside down. Now, while the Continental Congress was debating independence in Philadelphia, the British, under General Sir William Howe, were planning to invade New York and New Jersey, along with General Howe's older brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. Together, they had gathered about 25,000 soldiers and 10,000 sailors, the largest expeditionary force Britain would put together prior to World War I. George Washington, in contrast, was only able to gather about 19,000 soldiers, most of them poorly trained militia. And among General Howe's soldiers were about 9,000 German mercenaries, of the sort known as Hessians, and hired through King George III's connections in Germany. Again, because over half were from the state of Hesse-Kassel, they were known as Hessians in general by Americans. They formed highly trained and disciplined units and had a reputation for cruelty. Indeed, the transportation of Hessians to America was one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence. And despite the bravery of Continental troops, they were forced off Long Island and eventually out of New York City, leaving America's second largest city in British hands, where it would remain until 1783. However, Washington was able to keep his army together and prepare to fight another day, partly by leaving large campfires burning as his men retreated during the night to convince the British that the Americans were still there so they wouldn't chase them while they were retreating. Indeed, Washington's success in keeping his army together despite being defeated would be one of his greatest strengths, and is what would make America's victory in the Revolution successful. Washington lost many of his major battles, although to be sure, he won a few very important ones. But every time he lost, and the British expected him to surrender and the United States to fall with him, he held his army together and was prepared to fight another day, proving to be more patient than the British. Now, during the fighting in and around New York City, Washington needed a spy to go behind British lines. However, spying was considered dishonorable. One officer said, "I'm willing to go and fight them, but as for going among them and being taken and hung like a dog, I will not do it." Because, of course, a soldier found behind enemy lines out in civilian clothing is a spy, fit to be hanged. But eventually, Nathan Hale of Connecticut agreed to spy and had some success. He made his notes in Latin because he was a Yale graduate, passing on British troop numbers and information about their movements until a loyalist recognized him as a rebel sympathizer and turned him in. When the British searched him, they found his notes hidden in his shoes. They charged him with spying and hanged him. According to legend, at least, he said as his final words, "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And his statue is outside CIA headquarters today. Eventually, Washington withdrew into Pennsylvania. Congress itself abandoned Philadelphia and moved elsewhere in the state, and occasionally to other states. Washington's army itself was down to about 5,000 men, about a quarter what it had been in the summer, and many men's enlistment were due to run out. Most soldiers signed on for a few months or a year, in being a soldier being viewed as one's duty, but not one's entire life. So as the year was approaching its end, Washington expected most of his men's enlistment to run out. In the new year, he figured he'd have about 1,400 men left in his army. At this time, Thomas Paine began writing a series of pamphlets he entitled The Crisis, beginning the first volume with these famous words: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Now, the British, besides moving into New York and parts of Pennsylvania, had also moved into New Jersey, as had their Hessian mercenaries. Now, as the weather got worse late in the year, General Howe moved back to New York City, which was more comfortable and where he had a mistress. But the Hessians and many British troops remained in New Jersey. And during this time, Washington had some success with some minor raids against the British and the Hessians, and knowing that his men did outnumber the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey, he planned a daring night attack across the Delaware River. He would cross on Christmas night, hoping to catch the Hessians at dawn the 26th, tired, he hoped, perhaps hungover from celebrating Christmas. Crossing the Delaware was dangerous. Icebergs floated down the river. There was a blizzard so thick the men could barely see. It slowed down Washington's plans. They were not fully across the Delaware River and on the Jersey shore until 3 a.m. They'd expected to be across by midnight. And some of his men couldn't cross at all because of the weather. But the blizzard did hide their approach from the British, and local patriots were able to guide Washington and his men to Trenton. And all the Hessians were not in fact hung over. They were caught off guard. A sentry managed to sound the alarm. Eventually, the Hessians did form a line that formed some resistance, but they weren't able to hold off American forces, particularly once American artillery began firing into their ranks. Some of it commanded by a young captain from New York, Alexander Hamilton, who had to keep his finger over the touch hole of his cannon to keep it from freezing over. Furthermore, the Hessians communicated poorly in the disorder, and they split their forces instead of keeping them together. Finally, when their commander, Colonel Roche, was shot and fell off his horse, dying not long afterwards, the Hessian defense finally collapsed. 22 Hessians were killed, 83 seriously wounded, and 896 captured. A few managed to escape, but only a very few, because they had been at the far end of town from where Washington approached from. Washington, in contrast, lost only 2 men killed in the battle, only 5 wounded, one of whom was a lieutenant from Virginia, James Monroe, who was shot in the shoulder and nearly bled to death, and carried the musket ball in his body for the rest of his life, even through his presidency and beyond. Although, while losses in battle were quite low for Washington, many men died the next day of illness and exposure and exhaustion after crossing the river in the freezing cold at night. And while this was not a large battle, indeed Washington crossed the Delaware River back into Pennsylvania shortly afterwards, it was a big boost to American morale. Encouraged men to re-enlist when their enlistments expired, and breaking the Hessians' reputation as unbeatable killing machines. And Washington then crossed the Delaware again to win another small but important victory at Princeton. And and there's Princeton. To this day, you can see in the wall of Nassau Hall a dent in the wall where Alexander Hamilton's cannons hit the wall. Another cannonball went through a window and shot the head of the official portrait of King George III. And after these victories, Benjamin Franklin, who had gone to France as an American emissary to that kingdom, was now able to offer some victories to the French people. France, of course, was England's traditional enemy. Benjamin Franklin was incredibly charming. The sophisticated people of Paris, especially the ladies, fell in love with Dr. Franklin. He was already famous as a writer, a scientist, an inventor. He presented himself as a rustic American, wearing a rough fur hat. And the French were convinced by these victories that America might be worth helping, began to send some aid, some money, some supplies, but not yet soldiers or ships or official recognition, but a very important start nonetheless. Still, from Britain's point of view, these defeats were relatively minor. And so, in 1777, General Howe planned to conquer the rest of New York. He would move up the Hudson River, whereas General John Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny for his love of high living, would move down the Hudson River Valley from Canada. Colonel Barry St. Ledger would move in from western New York as well. They would converge at Albany and seize New York. Howe would also move into Philadelphia, and after capturing that, would move up to meet Burgoyne along the Hudson. Burgoyne sent out messengers, scouting parties and raiding parties, meant to capture supplies, but many would be cut off, many captured or killed. And so, in what we call the Saratoga Campaign, all the skirmishes and battles and movements around Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's invasion of New York, he ended up cut off, running low on supplies. Now, Washington was still down in Pennsylvania trying to defend Philadelphia, so General Horatio Gates, actually a veteran of the British Army, but one who, a bit like Washington, felt he had not been respected by the Army, Gates himself rising in rank because of his ability rather than his wealth or connections, which was unusual in the British Army, and resented the British and had resigned and joined the U.S. Army. He went north, as did General Benedict Arnold, a hero of the capture of Ticonderoga, and one of the most successful generals in the ultimately unsuccessful American invasion of Canada. Gates was in command, Arnold under his command, but he didn't think much of Gates, who he felt was too cautious. Ultimately, however, not only did they cut off Burgoyne, but force him into retreat. Benedict Arnold playing a decisive role in leading American troops and being badly wounded in the battle. And following a series of defeats, Burgoyne retreated to the north, trying to escape back to Canada, but by October 13th was completely surrounded. On October 17th, 1776, surrendered his entire army at Saratoga, New York. About 6,000 men, most of whom would be kept in prison camps for years to come. Again, despite Benedict Arnold's very important role in this victory, Congress did not really recognize it. Gates took all the credit for himself, and Benedict Arnold would, once again, feel slighted and mistreated by the United States. Now, this is a big military victory in and of itself, and saving Albany, New York from capture was very important. But the most important result of the battle, indeed one that will cause many historians to view it as the turning point of the American Revolution, was that it showed that America had a serious chance to win the war. And that in turn allowed Benjamin Franklin to eventually, although it still took a few months to happen officially, convince France to ally with the United States. Openly allying with the United States early in 1778, once it was clear Americans could beat a British army. And in years to come, Spain, whose royal family was related to that of France, and the Netherlands, who viewed Britain as a commercial rival, would ally with the United States as well. And the American Revolution would spread to Europe, indeed to European colonies around the world. Although, while these were the most important countries, no doubt, to support the United States, they were not the very first. In 1777, the Kingdom of Morocco had become the first country to recognize America officially as an independent country. They are America's oldest friend. And many years later, in World War II, when Americans crossed the Atlantic to liberate countries from the Nazis, the first place we went was not to France, but to Morocco in North Africa, paying back the favor. And again, the alliance with France would be so important that the victory at Saratoga is often considered the turning point of the Revolutionary War. Still, Howe was continuing to move into Pennsylvania, and Washington was trying to stay between him and Philadelphia. They would eventually fight at the Battle of Brandywine, September 11th, 1777, and it went very badly for Washington. While most of his men were very brave individually, and the small units, the militia companies they had trained in, they had not worked well together as a larger force. They were not cohesive as a whole army. His men retreated, the British pursued them till nightfall, and 2 weeks later, captured Philadelphia. But Washington again refused to surrender, and neither did the United States. Howe was shocked. Typically, when a nation's capital was captured, that country surrendered to the victorious army. That's just what you did in the 1700s. Although Washington did nearly lose his position as commander of the Continental Army, due in large part to the actions of a number of officers, including General Horatio Gates. This was a part of a larger plot known as the Conway Cabal, after an officer by the name of Thomas Conway, who is in fact not especially important in this plot, but was involved, as were a number of other officers, including General Horatio Gates, and a number of members of Congress. Gates, in particular, thought Washington was an amateur, Gates having been a professional in the British Army since the French and Indian War. Many members of Congress were unhappy with Washington's performance, and one can, to a point, see their point. Indeed, this plot against Washington was not the first plot against him. Another general who had served for many years in the British Army before joining the American cause, General Charles Lee, had been writing to Congress since late 1776, trying to convince them to replace Washington with himself. But the Conway Cabal was far more serious. Eventually, though, the plot failed. Some of the people involved were found out and humiliated. Washington was exonerated, in part because an influential French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, serving in Washington's staff out of his own enthusiasm for the American cause, convinced Congress that France viewed Washington as inseparable from the American cause. That if Congress were to fire Washington, France might lose their confidence in Congress. And Congress couldn't afford, of course, to offend the French. Now, in reality, Lafayette represented mainly himself. He did not represent the French government, as he sort of implied. And I'm not sure the French government viewed Washington as essential to the cause. After all, the victory that had most impressed them had been won officially by Horatio Gates and unofficially, largely by Benedict Arnold and the great militia commander, General Morgan, Daniel Morgan. But conspiracy was just one of Washington's problems in the winter of 1777 to 78. Armies typically quit fighting in the winter. It was cold, it was hard to travel on the roads. They would go into winter quarters. In 1777, Washington went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. His men built cabins to protect themselves from the harsh winter, but nonetheless about 2,000 died of starvation, freezing to death, or disease. But those who survived came out more committed, more cohesive, and better trained. Because, while encamped at Valley Forge, they were joined by another man from Europe, Friedrich von Steuben, who just arrived from Germany. He claimed, falsely, to have been a general in the Prussian army, considered the most professional army on the continent of Europe. He claimed, falsely, to be a baron in the German nobility. But while he wasn't all that he said he was an experienced military man, and he developed the drill that would be used by the U.S. Army until the War of 1812. And he began to train Washington's army in European-style conventional warfare, training them to load, to fire, to march quickly and efficiently, and especially trained them to use the bayonet. Now, American soldiers had had bayonets before, but they had not really used them much in combat. They are a little bit tricky to use effectively, and so that made them even more terrifying in the hands of the British. And the bayonet's a pretty terrifying weapon anyway. Of course, it fixes to the end of a musket, the musket itself being close to 6 feet long, with an 18-inch steel spike on the end of that. It turns the musket into a pretty terrifying spear. And beyond that, the bayonets in those days were triangular in shape, so they poked a pretty serious hole in a person that could not easily be sewn shut by a doctor. But once Americans learned to use bayonets themselves, they gained a bit of confidence in the face of the British. And also, during the encampment at Valley Forge, Washington was able to announce to his men America's official alliance with France. And this changed Britain's strategy too, as Britain felt the need to take a more defensive stance, as France could now threaten them in Europe and their colonies around the world, perhaps most importantly in the valuable sugar colonies of the Caribbean, where France and Spain also had, and the Netherlands also had colonies, and each wanted to seize the colonies of the other, and their delicious sugar. And so, the British felt they needed to concentrate their forces. Furthermore, General Howe resigned from command and was replaced by General Sir Henry Clinton, who, following orders from his superiors, abandoned Philadelphia and returned to New York so his forces would not be spread out too far. And so Philadelphia was liberated as the British decided to consolidate. As Clinton retreated from New York, Washington made plans to attack him, and did so at Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, on June 28, 1778. And all the battle began poorly, and some of Washington's men began to retreat. Washington stopped them, apparently cussing a blue streak as they ran, turned them around, and chased the British, pushing them back in the first major battle in which American soldiers used the bayonet. And the British retreated until nightfall. Indeed, through the night, they retreated and made it to New York City, which they would continue to hold until several months after the end of the war. And furthermore, the British would not really leave New York City for the rest of the war. They would hold it, but they wouldn't gain anything else of consequence in the North. And again, this showed the value of Baron von Steuben's training. The American Army successfully beat the British in the field of battle. And there would still be, fighting and this and that in the North. After 1778, the main action of the war shifted to the South. But this doesn't mean that the North was without some excitement, because both the British and the Continental Army kept large forces in the North, mostly guarding New York City, either from within, from Britain's point of view, or the outside for Washington, keeping the British trapped in. And during this long standoff, the most infamous act of treachery in American history occurred. Because as I have mentioned more than once, Benedict Arnold felt he had never gotten the respect he deserved for his victory at Ticonderoga, his role in the invasion of Canada, his vital role in the Saratoga Campaign, and America's alliance with France. Furthermore, after Washington placed Benedict Arnold in charge of Philadelphia in 1778, he met and married Peggy Shippen, the daughter of a Loyalist, a woman famous for her beauty, and also for her expensive tastes, who soon ran through Arnold's personal money. And there were accusations that Benedict Arnold began skimming off some money, or misappropriating funds in his role as commander of Philadelphia. And so, angry at Congress and short of money, in 1779, Loyalist friends of Peggy put Arnold in touch with the British High Command, and soon he was corresponding on a regular basis with Major John Andre, a very likable, cultured officer in the British Army who was in charge of Britain's spy efforts around New York City. And Arnold began providing Andre information about troop locations, troop movements, and eventually Andre asked him for the plans to West Point, a major fortress on the Hudson River. As time passed and Philadelphia was searched for Loyalists, the Arnold and Shippen families were being harassed. For a time, Arnold kind of laid low, but then in April of 1780, he got his chance. He was actually offered the command of West Point, which of course he accepted. And pretty soon he was passing information to the British again, and began weakening West Point's defenses, not repairing weak points, moving his men around into vulnerable positions, and leaving West Point itself almost completely unguarded. Finally, the British offered Arnold £20,000, which in those days was a lot of money. I should say probably about $8 million in today's money. for the plans to West Point, and Arnold agreed. September of 1780, John Andre and Benedict Arnold met behind American lines. Arnold rode Andre a pass to get safely back to British lines, but along the way he was intercepted and recognized as a British officer in civilian clothing. And the men who captured Andre were given, I believe, the first medal created by the United States as a reward for their service. When Arnold found out about Andre's capture, he escaped to British lines himself, but Andre was tried and executed. Despite the fact that many officers in Washington's army wanted to spare him because he was just such a likable guy. But Washington said spies had to be hanged. Arnold, on the other hand, was made a general in the British Army and served against the United States on several occasions and eventually retired to England. Now, around the same time, the Continental Navy was being developed, but it wasn't much. The United States primarily relied upon privateers and privately outfitted ships who would, with a letter of marque, a license from Congress, attack ships belonging to America's enemies. And what few ships we had in the Navy were mostly provided by the French. But our Navy, and certainly our privateers, were raiding British commerce, and on a few occasions won some very dramatic victories over the Royal Navy. Most famous of which was won by a former British sailor, John Paul Jones, sailing Bonhomme Richard, a gift from the French, sailing off the coast of Scotland, where he encountered His Majesty's ship Serapis, September 23rd, 1779. The two ships went to battle, and both were very badly damaged. Indeed, Bonhomme Richard was beginning to sink. Jones's chief gunner tried to surrender. Jones threw his pistols at him, knocking him out. When the British captain asked Jones himself if he wanted to surrender, he said, "I have not yet begun to fight." And eventually Jones won the battle, capturing not only the Serapis, but another British ship as well, although Bonhomme Richard had been so badly damaged that it sank 2 days after the battle, and he had to sail back to France with the ships he had captured. Beginning a very dramatic American victory. Jones is sometimes considered the father of the American Navy and also the father of the Russian Navy, as after the United States decommissioned our Navy following the Revolution, he went to Russia to work for Empress Catherine the Great. Now, while the early phases of the American Revolutionary War were mostly fought in the North, there were a few battles in the South, even before the focus of the war turned that way in the late 1770s. June 28, 1776, Sir Henry Clinton, not yet overall commander of British forces, had led an attack on Charleston, South Carolina, whose defense was led by William Moultrie. He built a fort of palmetto trees and sand on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor. These were freshly cut palmetto trees. The wood was still green and soft. When the cannonballs hit them, rather than shattering them as they would have dry wood, the cannonballs bounced off, and the British attack failed. The Battle of Charleston kept Charleston a free city, which is commemorated by South Carolina's flag today, which features the palmetto tree very prominently in its center. And the crescent moon in the corner was also inspired by a little crescent moon badge worn by Moultrie's men. In a time before uniforms were that common, soldiers, and especially militia, often identified themselves by some sort of badge, typically worn on or in their hat. A bit further west, indeed west of the Proclamation Line, where many Americans had settled in violation of the law, something too had to be done. And British Indian agents began to encourage Indians in the West to attack people living west of the Proclamation Line. Indeed, one of the criticisms of the king in the Declaration of Independence was that he, through his Indian agents, had endeavored to bring upon the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, which, when NPR sometimes tweets the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, gets banned by Twitter because you can't call them Indian savages anymore. Um, One place this affected was now Upper East Tennessee, where indeed people had been settling since 1770 or possibly 69. And because they were west of the Proclamation line and outside the protection or control of any British colonial government officially, but wanted a government of their own to provide law and order and registered titles to their land, they had formed their own government, as Americans on the frontier tend to do. They called it the Watauga Association, formed in 1772, making them, according to Theodore Roosevelt, the first truly independent government created on the American continent. And according to the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, they were a dangerous example to the rest of America. The Wataugans defended themselves from Cherokee warriors, led by, among others, Dragging Canoe, by building forts in what is now modern Elizabethton and Bluff City, and a third elsewhere which was destroyed before it was completed. And furthermore, counterattacking against the Cherokee near what is now modern Kingsport. One of those forts was known as Fort Caswell, after the governor of North Carolina, which today has been recreated close to its original site in Elizabethton, Tennessee. And as the Wataugans held off attacks by the Cherokee, they petitioned North Carolina to be recognized as part of North Carolina and were declared to be the Washington District, which later evolved into Washington County, the oldest county in Tennessee and the first place on earth named for George Washington. Now, as I've mentioned, after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, the British began to concentrate on the South. For one thing, it was felt that there were more loyalists in the South who might support the British Army if it moved into the South to back them up. And so, in December of 1778, a British force of about 3,500 troops sent from New York by General Clinton captured the city of Savannah, by far the largest settlement in Georgia, and they would essentially control Georgia for the remainder of the war. He moved north and April laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina, under the command of the American General Benjamin Lincoln. And after a month of siege and starvation, Lincoln was forced to surrender, along with over 5,000 American soldiers. The worst defeat of the war for America, the largest surrender of American forces until 1942, when our soldiers in the Bataan Peninsula surrendered to the Japanese. And in both those surrenders, the prisoners who surrendered faced horrendous conditions. Many of the prisoners captured by the British were loaded onto prison ships, old, rotten ships unfit to sail on the ocean anymore. This is one of the most infamous, HMS Jersey, rotting in New York Harbor, but there are others in Charleston Harbor. It's estimated as many as 3/4 of the prisoners held on such ships died. And among those who died on the prison ships in Charleston was a local woman who had volunteered to go and serve as a nurse for American prisoners of war, and that was the mother of Andrew Jackson, who would never forgive the British. Still, with the fall of Savannah and Charleston, Southern Loyalists became much bolder in fighting back against the revolutionaries, and soon the South was embroiled, really, in a civil war, as Loyalists and Patriots attacked each other over the issues of the war, or in some cases used them as an excuse to settle old grudges. And most of the Loyalist and Patriot forces in Georgia and South Carolina were not organized as part of the regular army, but as militia. Some turned to guerrilla warfare. One of the most famous guerrilla leaders was Francis Marion. In his youth, he'd been a sailor in the Caribbean, until his schooner, a small ship, was sunk when it crashed into a whale. He had fought against the Cherokee in the French and Indian War. He was given a commission in the U.S. Army in 1776, only escaped capture in 1780 because he was away from Charleston, recovering from a broken ankle at home. But when he recovered, he gathered what militia he could and began a guerrilla war against the British, attacking small groups of soldiers, capturing supplies, and vanishing into the woods and swamps of South Carolina, where the British could not find him. British Colonel Bannister Tarleton was among the officers charged with hunting him down, but had so little luck. He said, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." And afterwards Marion was known as the Swamp Fox, and would be one of the inspirations for the main fictional character in the movie The Patriot. Still, General Clinton had captured two of the major port cities in the South and returned to New York City to command the defenses there, and left General Charles Cornwallis in charge of British forces in the Carolinas. In August of 1780, veteran British forces defeated largely unexperienced Americans in the Battle of Camden. American forces retreated in incredible haste, including their commander, General Horatio Gates, who was in command of the army in the South. He was so demoralized by the defeat that he not only ran, he entirely outran his own army in the retreat, riding for 3 days and into the next state. After which he was replaced by General Nathaniel Greene, who had served alongside Washington since the early days of the war. A promising British officer in Cornwallis's army was Major Patrick Ferguson, who had fought in the war in the North, had even invented a type of breech-loading rifle, officially adopted but never actually really used by the British Army. And he was given command of protecting the western wing of Cornwallis's whole army. He had a force of about 1,000 men, almost all of them Loyalists, supporting the king. He was told to protect the rest of the army and hunt down the rest of the rebels. Indeed, he planned to lead his forces over the mountains to deal with them, as the Appalachian Mountains was seen as a hotbed of rebel activity. He sent a message to the people living in what is now East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, the very western North Carolina, told them to lay down their arms and join him, or he would march over the mountains, hang their leader, and lay waste to their country with fire and sword. In response, the militia of the region gathered. On September 25th, 1780, at Sycamore Shoals, a shallow place in the Watauga River by modern-day Elizabethton, Tennessee. So many men wanted to go and fight that some had to be drafted, not to fight, but to stay home to protect the settlements in case the Cherokee should attack again. And from there, they marched over the mountains to find Ferguson, and so are remembered as the Over Mountain Men. In marching, some all the way from southwestern Virginia around modern Abingdon, through East Tennessee, through North Carolina, eventually to Kings Mountain, which is really more of a long, low hill right on the border of North and South Carolina, where Major Ferguson had encamped on the top of the mountain, swearing that God himself could not get him off the mountain. But in about an hour, about 900 frontiersmen did, charging repeatedly up the mountain, about 900 of them defeating Ferguson's force of about 1,100 Loyalists. Ferguson himself was shot off his horse, hit 8 times before he hit the ground, and buried on top of Kings Mountain. In a way, his pledge turned out to be true. He said that God himself could not get him off the mountain, and he is still there. After this, and after a similar victory at the Battle of Cowpens a few months later, Cornwallis's western wing was undefended and open to attacks by Patriot militia. And furthermore, after these victories, Loyalists were much less willing to openly support the crown. And so some historians, particularly those in East Tennessee, but also men such as Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt, described the victory at Kings Mountain as the turning point of the American Revolution, which is probably not entirely accurate, but we'll take it. Certainly it played a big role in keeping these southern colonies independent. And from here, Cornwallis felt he had to pull back to the coast. And General Greene encouraged this, retreating from Cornwallis, luring Cornwallis after him. In a series of marches across North Carolina, the rapidly moving Greene essentially forced Cornwallis to burn most of his supplies in order to move fast enough to keep up with him. He did eventually catch up with him at Guilford Courthouse, where Cornwallis would technically win a victory, but a very costly one. After which point, he retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, where American forces under Greene surrounded him, and at last George Washington came south, along with about 5,000 recently arrived French troops under the command of General Rochambeau, who, though a very experienced general himself and a member of the French nobility, always deferred to Washington as commander of the army, unlike many of Washington's American generals who were frequently defiant towards him. And they surrounded Yorktown when the British Navy attempted to come to Yorktown and assist Cornwallis or evacuate him. A French fleet commanded by the Admiral de Grasse defeated the British in the Battle of the Chesapeake, sometimes also called the Battle of the Capes, in September of 1781. So there was no rescue, no escape for Cornwallis. And October 9th, 1781, Washington fired the ceremonial first shot into Yorktown as the siege grew hot. The British tried to build defenses, but eventually American and French forces stormed two key redoubts, large earthworks, dirt and wood fortifications protecting the approach to the city. The French captured Redoubt Number 9. Americans, commanded by Alexander Hamilton, captured Redoubt Number 10, October 14th, 1781. And shortly afterwards, Cornwallis agreed to surrender, officially surrendering on October 19th, 1781. And as British forces marched out of town, between American and French soldiers lined up to watch them, British musicians played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And this was the last major battle of the war in America, although there certainly were some skirmishes and minor battles here, and battles elsewhere in what had become another worldwide war. And the Treaty of Paris, sometimes called the Peace of Paris, was not signed until 1783. In this Treaty of Paris, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States, set the northern border of the United States approximately where it is today, between us and Canada. It established the Mississippi River as the border between the U.S. and Spanish Louisiana, and promised that the Mississippi River would forever be open to navigation by America and Britain and Spain. Britain gave Florida back to Spain, having taken it from them in the French and Indian War. British troops were supposed to be removed from U.S. territory, although some would remain till 1815 at least. It promised the security of the liberty and property of Loyalists and the repayment of those who'd lost property during the war. All of this often did not take place. And thousands, 65,000 I've read one place, over 100,000 I've read elsewhere, left America, many going to Canada, others went to other British colonies, some went to Britain herself. And so the great hero of this would be George Washington. Some have called him the indispensable man, the man America could not have done without, which may seem odd considering he lost most of his battles, was not especially well educated, and was not liked or respected by a number of his fellow generals who were jealous of his position. But he was the man we needed at the time. In more than any other commander, many of whom wanted to win a decisive victory on the battlefield, as European armies like to do, he understood that America didn't have to win, we just had to not lose, to keep his army intact and harass the British until they got tired of the war effort. He could lose, at least for a time, major cities, At different points, the British did occupy Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, but he always kept his army together to fight another day until he finally got his chance for a decisive moment at Yorktown, where he seized the victory. This may not have been a tactically brilliant strategy, but it was effective, and it won the war. He was a man of honor and character, guided by his principles. He said his hero was the Roman Cincinnatus, a successful general who had retired to his farm until in a time of crisis the Roman Senate offered to make him dictator, and he accepted absolute rule of the Roman Republic, went on to win his battles, and then resigned his power, retiring to his farm. And Washington always said that's all he wanted to do. And he got a chance to prove this at Newburgh, New York, when the war was nearly over. Most of his army had not been paid by Congress for months. Many men were unhappy, indeed disgusted by what they saw as the very bad behavior of Congress. And at his headquarters in Newburgh, a group of officers planned to propose that Washington lead them and the army to Congress and either demand, even seize their back pay, and perhaps take over the country by force, or move west and set up a new country with Washington as king. Some army officers wanted to make Washington king of America. Washington found out about this plot, about the offer they planned to make before they could make it, and March 13, 1783, called for a meeting of his officers, where he said he had heard of this plan and told his men to ignore it, as you value your own sacred honor. And then he pulled out a letter from Congress, at least one member of Congress, which described how Congress did plan to respond to the Army's complaints. But before reading it, he put on his glasses. Most of his officers did not even know he needed glasses. Washington was viewed as a man of supreme physical power. He was tall, he was an expert horseback rider, he was very strong physically. But he put on his glasses. He said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in your service." He read the letter and walked out of the meeting, leaving his officers in tears. So Washington's integrity saved the young nation from the path of so many other revolutions that ended up in brand new dictatorships. At last, the British did evacuate New York City over 2 months after the official signing of the peace treaty. In December, Washington resigned his commission in the Army, and as he had always said he wished to do, retired to his estate at Mount Vernon. And nothing else, this proved true the words of all people, King George III. He had recently spoken with an American painter, Benjamin West, who was visiting London, asked what West thought Washington would do after the war. And West said he thought that George Washington would resign and return to his private life. And the king replied, "If he does that, sir, he will be the greatest man in the world."